are they all then, should that be accounted for in the model under that student population count?
Heidi Hartz for the record. I think that the department would like the opportunity to do a little bit more research on that school-wide designation.
And I just want to make sure that we, I do want to make sure that we stick to the item number 5 is recommendation regarding the definition of at-risk, and we do have a motion on the table. So, Member Jensen, given that in mind.
So my comment is I believe we have already directed NDE to stand up the model based upon the existing recommendation for purposes of the blueprint. So I am opposed to moving forward with accepting the motion, and I can make a counter motion or just vote against it. I would support Member Fueling's recommendation that since we've already directed the model to be stood up, that we take the time to take a look at what NDE has to bring forward, and we define this correctly right out of the gate.
Okay, so or move forward with the motion?
I'm actually having a difficult time discerning between the motion I made, which did include a commitment to continue to looking for alternative ways to perhaps construct a measure, and the suggested counter motion. So I actually I'm having a difficult time seeing a difference between the two.
Okay, in that case, let's go ahead with the motion as it stands, and then we'll go back and revisit. I think that's Member Jensen. We'll just move forward with the motion that stands, and then we'll move back if we need to, okay? So, those in favor of the motion, please say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed?
No.
Nay. Aye.
So just for Dave, just to affirm that you were opposed, and Dusty, I didn't hear yours, just to do a check.
That's correct, opposed.
Okay. And the motion passes. So we'll continue to use free and reduced lunch to stand up the model, and you will immediately get to work to take a look at other options. Well, explore the conduct of at risk, correct? Thank you. Okay. Moving on to number 6, work group reports. I'm going to ask Member Jensen and Member McIntosh. The question is, Member Jensen, do you want someone else to report out for you, or yes? And do you have a designee?
Yes, Mr. Johnson.
Okay. Member Johnson, would you like to report out for the formula and distribution work group?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would be happy to, and make sure that all of my comments reflect poorly on Mr. Jensen. I'm sorry you're not feeling well, Dave, so hopefully I'm adequate stunt double. So first of all, before I start off, I just wanted to point out my observation on this whole process, and the foresight that the crafters of this legislation had in order to create this committee and this process. We have had changes that will affect most of these weights that have been due to a lot of the deliberation that we've had at these meetings. So I'm thankful for the people that have taken the time to come to these meetings to voice their opinions. And I think it's important that we understand that their opinions matter, and that those opinions and the facts and information that we've had at these presentations has been incorporated into these documents. So it's a good living process. And I wanted to start off by at least framing it that way. So The real meat of the meeting that we had started with the presentations that we had with respect to the comparable wage index and other cost adjustment factors as it's represented in here. And one of the things that we had talked about and one of the points of anxiety was the cost adjustment factor that was called the CWI, or comparable wage index. And there was a perception that since it only affected one entity, that perhaps there should be other measures. And not that a factor that affects one entity is necessarily bad, because if you pin a factor and the results are comprehensive enough that it actually does influence that one entity, then perhaps that is truly what the factor should be. But I think there was consensus, or at least a general understanding, that we needed to have something a little bit more broader than just a comparable wage index, because that comparable wage index we had at the time was for professional services, and it didn't take into considerations other aspects of school district's budget and costs. So the consultants of APA went through a process, and their presentation overview started with reviewing stakeholder feedback and then reviewing 3 scenarios that they provided and discussing regional cost adjustments. And what they came up with was a cost of living factor, a CWI for all workers, all education levels, and a Nevada cost economic index, or Nevada cost of education index. And in going through that, we went from a factor that influenced one or some to factors for the CWI for all workers and education levels affected 12 of the 15 school districts. And the Nevada cost of education index affected 12 of 15 as well. So it seemed to be something that was more reflective of more operating aspects and costs of school districts. And their recommendation was to go to the Nevada cost of education index, which, it was a working group meeting without voting. So it's just a summary of their presentation. And members that were part of that group, please feel free to jump in at any time with your comments to help with providing an update. The next thing that we went through was the necessarily small school adjustment. And the point of contention that we had previously, or I guess mystery, was that 50, how do we arrive at 50? Is 50 the right number for Nevada? And should there be other things that we need to consider? So as a part of the listening and a part of the testimony, change was incorporated into these presentations. And again, APA, as part of their process, went and asked folks in the field, solicited input from the stakeholders, and they came up with some information that was more Nevada specific, which is what we kept saying, and I think what they kept hearing. So it was interesting to know that they took a look at stratified layers of schools and sizes. Less than 25 students, there were 34 schools in 9 school districts. There was less than 50, there's 46, less than 100, there's 69, less than 125, there's 77 schools, and less than 150 students, there were 83 schools. So they took a look at different thresholds to identify what level, what breakpoint small should be. And I think there were over 600 schools, 660, as I would have said. Thank you very much for recalling that. So, 83 compared to 660 is still a small percentage in the whole grand scheme of things. So they actually had recommended that we come up with a tiered implementation of the necessarily small schools that ranges from less than 7 students to between 125 to 149 students. And there's information in there that kind of breaks down in table form what that means. So I think it was an example of listening to the concerns and addressing something that meets more Nevada's demographics than just taking something from another state and plugging it in. Then we looked at the district size adjustment. And many of the concerns with both of these models is to make sure that we captured the uniqueness of the costs and characteristics of small schools, whether they're geographically isolated or small for whatever reasons. And the same analogy kind of holds true in many aspects with respect to the small school district or district size. And the APA again went through to solicit stakeholder feedback and identify those things that school district CFOs and professionals would identify as those factors that would influence cost and escalate costs, because the theory is to provide an equitable distribution, take into consideration economies of scale or diseconomies of scales, labor and competition and all of that stuff. They had initial recommendations in their published report that seemed to still make sense with respect to Nevada. So this is an instance where they went out and surveyed information and reached the same conclusion similarly that they did previously. So their recommendation was to move forward with the recommendations that were included in the original report. And I'm looking out at Amanda and she's shaking her head yes. So that means I remember that correctly. Then we covered something that was a little bit more vague, and it had to do with the cost adjustment factor for administrative expenses. And I kind of wanted to lead with a question that Mark Mathers had brought out, is why was this even contemplated to begin with? And he teased me that we didn't really go down that to talk about that, because I think the purpose of the study was to identify the factor and more about how to come up with an administrative expense piece, as opposed to the intent of why it was even included in the legislation to begin with. But I thought it was a salient question, and I just wanted to reiterate that more so Mark didn't yell at me in the future than anything else. But I appreciate the comment. And also, before I go any further, one thing that David, since he is lacking his voice today, he sent me a text. And his comment that we weren't able to get to at the time was that there's adjustments for necessarily small schools and other factors, yet in the administrative piece, there didn't seem to be any cost adjustment factors for size in there at this point. And that's something that should be considered. Dave, did that kind of capture what you were talking about? And I got a thumbs up from David, so that was good. So in the process of the feedback that APA went through in order to figure this piece out for us, they basically concluded that there's really not a standard for this piece. There's really no format or model that we can go to and say, this one works, or there's no best practice, I guess, that we could take a look at. So, we're really going to be on the frontier with respect to Nevada to figuring out what we are going to include in administrative costs. One of the first things that they did was to review the language of the bill to see if there was a definition of administrative expense. There is no definition of administrative expense, just says there is one. So as we pointed out in other meetings, and again during these meetings, school districts have a tendency to record things differently. So what we would include as administrative expense may not be the same language or the same things included in other school districts' administrative expense. So we have to work on becoming more consistent in all of those types of things, which I'm sure the reporting and accountability group is working through and struggling with. And then, so I don't know that we had a clear direction on that. The functions that we included as general administration were superintendent's office, cabinet board, business services, payroll, HR, curriculum, coaching, and PD, legal, communications, community engagement, purchasing, warehouse, IT, assessment, grants, research, evaluation, accountability, compliance, behavioral services, and other district managed items such as maintenance and operations. Then we talked about the administrative burden for the weighted programs and one of the questions that I had that I didn't ask at the time was, are the administrative burdens or costs associated with those weights included as part of the weighted funding, or is that part of the administrative costs? I'm not sure which piece, because some of it does have some overlap. So I guess the bottom line of this one was that there's still work to be done. They provided a number of examples from different states. Arkansas, for example, Arkansas sets base funding amount using a resource allocation matrix model. They have 7% for central office and 10% for operation and maintenance. Wyoming, for example, has a resource allocation model that determines school and district resources generated in a block grant amount. They also have, looks like, central office costs of 10 to 20%, total district costs from 20 to 30%. So basically, I guess the bottom line, in order to cut this short, give you the Reader's Digest version, so to speak, is we're probably going to have to go through a process of defining what it is for Nevada, what costs should be incorporated in that, and further hone and fine tune what that really should be and that impact on a district by district basis. And I think we do need to consider that there was some general acknowledgement that it's going to be higher for smaller school districts because the cost per pupil is going to be higher because there's fewer, the denominator smaller. Or, yeah. I think that was basically about it. There's still a lot of mystery with respect to the administrative piece, and there's still a lot of work to be done on that. And whatever we craft is going to be, it's really not going to be something that's going to be consistent or modeled after any other date.
Okay, thank you. Can you do the other report and then you'll hold it? Okay. Member McIntosh, your report. And also just remember that we have 2 agenda items connected to these groups in terms of recommendations. So we'll have an opportunity to discuss them too. Member McIntosh, your report.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This is Commissioner McIntosh, for the record, reporting on the reporting and monitoring subwork group. I'm going to start with item number 4 in our work group, which was related to the budget comparisons that are required under Section 76 of Senate Bill 543. And so in the previous commission meeting, we had made some determinations regarding how we might go about providing these budget comparisons. And this would be taking the current fiscal year, so fiscal year 2020 financial data, which school districts have already provided to their amended final budgets, and then taking the pupil-centered funding plan and putting it in a similar model so there could be a comparison of budgets between school districts. And so we had previously agreed as a commission on the worksheets that could be used to provide this comparison. There were worksheets that already existed within the state forms provided by the Department of Taxation, so that we thought they were suitable, but they did require some amendment by the Nevada Department of Education. And so those amendments or those changes to those forms were provided by Mr. Kirkpatrick from the Nevada Department of Education. We had some discussion again regarding the template, but unless there's any further discussion, I think it's an agenda item on here, but unless there's further discussion regarding that template, our recommendation out of the commission again was to approve the template provided by Mr. Kirkpatrick, that the NDE would begin sending out that template in the first week of March to school districts if there needed to be some further discussion or maybe some changes due to the unique nature of your specific district and some line items that might need to be included. We would look to the Department of Ed for direction in putting that information together in those formats. And so the expectation, at least from that item, was that the NDE would begin sending those out the first week of March. And I think most members were, although this isn't the perfect way to compare budgets, I think there was a lot of question regarding the value of comparing these budgets, a lot of value regarding comparing expenditures. If you were to receive additional revenues, what is the purpose of augmenting your expenditures in a year where you actually didn't receive the revenue? And so there may be some questions about how those dollars are allocated. I think, again, we went back to the discussion of at-risk, which I think is going to be one of the most difficult pieces to determine how those expenditures are allocated by school districts and how they're actually recorded. So just to put that out there. Then we moved on to item number 5, and this was in relation and a request from the commission or the work group previously regarding all of the state grants incorporated now into base funding in the pupil-centered funding model. We had asked the Department of Ed to provide a presentation on all of these separate line item appropriations These are normally, many of them are normally discreetly included in what is called the funding bill or the appropriation bill for a school district at the end of a legislative session. These are the legislatively approved dollars for the various programs. We've been asking the Department of Ed to provide us with that list. What were the requirements of all of those programs and where were they located within statute? The majority of those state category, actually 99% of those state categorical funds that are discreetly provided for in the appropriations bill. So all those dollars now, it is our understanding, will flow into what would be considered base funding, including class size reduction. So there will no longer be a need to track those dollars separately in separate state categorical funds. Those will be distributed to school districts as part of base funding. It was the understanding in conversation with the Department of Ed, particularly Mr. Bennett, who presented that more authority would be given to school districts, flexibility given to school districts on how they spend those dollars. It was our understanding also in that conversation that the only regulatory requirement or additional statutory requirements were related to class size reduction. There is a separate statute related to the ratios that must be met for class size reduction and separate requirements for the reporting of class size reduction. And those ratios and statutory requirements don't go away. But the others, as our understanding, are discreetly included in the appropriations bill. And we were of the understanding that any legislatively approved bill that would come forward now would just be incorporated in the base, and school districts would now have the flexibility to use those dollars as needed, similar to a block grant. Moving on then, we had a discussion from West Ed. So I'd like to say thank you again to our presenters from West Ed. They provided us some information regarding, we have consistently been asking for information regarding exemplars within the area or other school districts that have moved to a weighted funding model. And we have been asking them for recommendations in terms of the implementation and how we can look to some of these other school districts that have successfully implemented a weighted funding model. I would highly recommend the presentation is out there online. It's very succinct. It has very many long-term, short-term recommendations for this commission, for the Department of Education. But I'm just going to very quickly kind of hit some of the highlights. Their first objective was to prioritize and identify the most important objectives for this committee. So there were guiding principles that went into the creation of Senate Bill 543. They've identified 4 that they consider to be most important, particularly across the country. Those include equity, accountability, autonomy, and transparency. They felt with Senate Bill 543 was mainly focused on equity and transparency. And so as we make decisions for how we report information, as we make decisions for how we monitor information, they felt that anything we do, we ought to really be looking at those 2 main areas to making sure that we are aligned with those guiding principles. Other recommendations that that West Ed made included that the commission should be again looking at how they're going to recommend how new funds that go into the funding formula are directed. Will new funds, for example, if new dollars are provided by the legislature, the funding formula is very clear on how new dollars flow into the fund. But are there recommendations that this commission might make to determine how new dollars should go in? This led to a discussion about how inadequately funded the base is. And even under the new funding model, the base is still inadequately funded. And we are applying weights to an inadequately funded base. And so if additional dollars were provided into the funding model, would we provide those dollars into tier E? Or would would there be a recommendation that no, you've got to get the base to an adequate level of funding? We asked what other school districts were doing or what other state Department of Education's or education agencies were doing. And they were kind of across the board. You had some particular school districts where as new funds are added, those funds are simply added to the base. And then of course that would, you'd be applying the weights to that higher level base, and then the weights would rise proportionately. You have other school districts that set adequacy targets, and as new funding is provided, they try to attempt to hit those adequacy targets for those school districts that are furthest away from those targets. And so again, it's just some recommendations by West Ed as to some recommendations we might be making to the Legislative Committee on Education. the law is very specific as to how Senate Bill 543 operates. So there was some discussion about how that might look or how that might work in the form of a recommendation. They did recommend that the Nevada Department of Ed adopt a common financial data management system. It's my understanding that the Department of Ed has already begun moving forward with this process, and they currently have an RFP. I don't know if they've let the RFP yet or if it's out, but they're currently working on an RFP for this purpose. But that recommendation is currently being worked on. They do believe that there needs to be some sort of validation rules and a sign-off process. I think this just goes back to ensuring, similar to the conversation we had with Mr. Aguero this morning, to ensure that the appropriate amount of dollars are put into the base, and that the process per Senate Bill 543 is working appropriately, but they do believe that there needs to be a creation of validation rules and ultimately a sign-off process for those rules. They did recommend a consolidation of deadlines in terms of reporting not just student data but financial data. So getting some clear and maybe some more concise deadlines in terms when financial and student data is reported, and locking in certain dates where data is locked down, and this is the lock date for the data. And just to help minimize the number of dates of data collection and reporting on a regular basis. If any of my committee members want to jump in, I was attempting to take notes. We had a very short period of time. We had several presentations, and I was trying to listen and ask questions as well. So if I'm missing anything, please let me know if I'm missing something important that you feel needs to be included in this summary. They did recommend staffing, or they're going to be in their work regarding making recommendations for staffing or resource recommendations. They would like to know what data needs to be tracked in order to make sure that Senate Bill 543 is working appropriately. So they'll begin their work there as well. How will we prioritize, or will the state prioritize academic outcomes in the forms of Senate Bill 543? How do we have those rigorous discussions about student outcomes? And how will we, and I think here they were very much recommending limiting the metrics of success to a limited number of metrics to determine success in order to simplify the process. And then they'd like to, the recommendation is we should be establishing or developing some reports or internal analysis or procedures around the relevant consequences surrounding those metrics. So if the Senate Bill 543 is not working as expected, either financially or academically, what are the sanctions or the supports that the state might provide in order to either meet financial targets or academic targets, and how will we go about creating those staged approaches to the school districts in order to intensify consequences for not meeting targets. With that, we jumped over to a discussion with a company called Insight. Insight is a reporting company. If you're not familiar with Insight, school districts in general rely on the State Department of Education providing with a handbook for their accounting information. That accounting information comes from the National Center for Education Statistics. There's generally derived from the National Center for Education Statistics. As we've had a lot of discussion about, school districts may be, and probably are, reporting certain pieces of data differently from each other. The goal of Insight, which is actually paid for by the Legislative Counsel Bureau, it's an activity-based costing model that helps allocate costs to schools. And in order to make it consistent and comparable at the school level, the purpose of Insight reporting is to sort of gather the information, the accounting information from school districts, allocate the appropriate costs out to school, and come up with a school per pupil amount. And so it's sort of to take away the fact that many school districts might not be reporting data the same way, comparably, and to make the data more consistent and comparable among schools and school districts. And so, for example, in many cases, there's a lot of costs that are recorded at the central office level that really should be allocated to schools. We aren't necessarily allocated to schools in our accounting systems, and so Insight is the methodology or the process by which they can allocate these costs out to the schools. So Insight uses several key pieces of data to allocate costs, and so they felt they were a pretty good current repository of data. This is some of the information we've been asking for, but they do track data regarding building square footage, student enrollment, various pieces that we've been asking for in this comprehensive list of data that might be available. They felt that they were a pretty current repository of several pieces of current information. There were some concerns amongst members regarding the data as reported at Insight, whether Insight uses similar methodologies among school districts to allocate costs. I happen to know that Clark is very good about allocating actual expenditure costs out to schools and can report actual costs at a very fine level of detail at the school level, whereas if the school district isn't doing that, that Insight is just allocating those costs based off either student enrollment or the size of the building, right? And so there could be some confusion. I think there was some concerns from school districts regarding how Insight was actually recording or allocating some of their costs. So maybe there needed to be some further information from Insight as to how they actually utilize data, what their methodologies are for allocating data, but maybe some cleaning up of data among school districts to ensure that we are all reporting our data similarly, or they're using a similar, at least, allocation methodology for allocating those costs to schools, so those numbers can be more defensible by school districts. Insight finalized their presentation by saying they felt they would be very well suited to report information for Senate Bill 543 for what it's worth. More discussion may be required was ultimately the takeaway, I think, from the group. And with that, we didn't have a whole lot of time left. There were still two large presentations from West Ed, which we asked them to wrap up in just a couple minutes, which they did. And so I'm going to be very reductive here in terms of, and they were probably very reductive in their presentation, but item 7 was regarding the update on their work plan to determine the anticipated level of effort and fiscal impact of the reporting requirements included in Senate Bill 543. It is my understanding from West Ed, and they can correct me if I'm wrong, that they plan on looking at 5 or 6 local education agencies that have they want to see some different configurations of how LEAs are pulling information together. And they want to do some surveys at first, but they'd really like to know who's involved in each system, like who on the ground is involved in grants, how does the methodology or the process work, what does it look like, and then they want to analyze the current state and then give a report back to the State Department of Education as to what might be, or the gap analysis, I suppose, between the current position of school districts and the differences and to where we might go. Item number 8 was an update on the work plan to provide guidance to school districts to support the implementation of the PCFP. And very simply, I think all we really discussed there was that the primary approach would be to use this incremental approach in order to guide school districts, and this stair-step approach, taking things very slowly, which is something that was a recommendation from other state education agencies, and being very careful and thoughtful about how you move these pieces forward. I know it seems that there's very slowly at time, but that was a recommendation from one of the state education agencies, and using this kind of incremental stair-step approach and how you move forward with the implementation. And with that, I'd look to some of my other members if there were some salient pieces that I missed, but that is the report out from the reporting and monitoring work group.
Okay, we do have a question from AJ, remember? Okay, Member Fueling, a question from the earlier report?
Sort of for Member Johnson, but didn't we recently get an email from James Kirkpatrick, who has been incessantly asking for information? But regarding, it's a good thing. It's a good thing.
In a good way, that was a compliment.
Yeah. But regarding the administrative expenditure costs, does that sound familiar? Or I'm just wondering if I'm remembering that correctly, and if so, if that data.
Madam Chair, if you'll allow me to respond.
Please do.
Mr. Fueling's test of my memory. I thought what I recalled was information with respect to transportation and how we were categorizing. That was the most recent one. I don't recall the administrative expenses piece.
Member, maybe you're just anticipating. That's James's email this week.
You can see how traumatized I am by this.
Madam Chair,
Yes,
one thing that AJ was going to ask me, but he didn't realize it until I'm just going to bring it up to him right now, was the density factor, which he has talked about in previous discussions, and how we account for the economies of scales in decentralized counties, which is something that we talked about and I omitted, I forgot, and it wasn't until you asked me that question that I recalled that. But the response that we had from APA was that many of those factors would be included in their kind of hybrid Nevada cost of education statistic, which is a more encompassing factor for all school district expenditure. So it is some way addressed in there, but not directly addressed in there. But we do not have something that would be called a density factor.
Other questions? Carson City. Member Jensen, Member Casey, no questions? Okay, hearing no questions, let's go ahead and move to item number 7. So I'm going to ask again, Member Jensen, this is the discussion and possible approval of recommendations. So I guess the question would be, we could take these A, then B, then C, then D, or recommendations in terms of the overall. And do you want to have a designee to do this, or designee? I think I'm seeing a yes for a designee. So is that Member Johnson is a designee? I think you're getting a yes.
Well, as I was busy not paying attention, I'm not quite certain what I was designated for, but I think it was
Okay.
for
Item number 7, we
okay.
have an opportunity to discuss and possibly approve. We don't have to, but we can certainly help the world move forward
the cost adjustment factor.
for cost adjustment factors, necessarily small school adjustment, small district equity adjustment, and weights for categories of pupils. So we can take those one at a time, or if you want to group something because you think it goes together, how would you like to?
Well, I think let's just, I think it's best to go item by item on here.
Good.
So I think that there was, we couldn't gain consensus, but I didn't have any dissension or objections to the cost adjustment factors that APA had recommended for in lieu of the CWI. So, but we can talk, I think it would be best to have the members of the committee discuss that as well.
So let's go ahead and do it this way. I'm going to restate what I think your recommendation is, and then we'll see if there's discussion around it, and then we'll see if there's a motion around that, and then we'll see if anything is approved or just discussed. How's that sound?
That's perfect.
All righty. Okay, so I think what you were recommending is that APA recommended the Nevada education cost, the NC. Oh, NC, the C comes first. Okay, NCEI, so Nevada Cost of Education Index. So that's what you're recommending to accept for that one?
I would
With
feel
discussion?
comfortable that our group would bring that forward, yes.
Okay, so questions, discussion?
Yeah.
Mark?
Yeah, Mark Mathers. Paul, I don't think we made a recommendation on this.
That's what we're doing now. So
Okay.
let's discuss the recommendation.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
So you want to discuss it? Thoughts on that as a recommendation or not?
Sure, I'll start the ball rolling. Sure. So again, Mark Mathers. I mean, this is, again, one I struggle with, and maybe I'm struggling over most of these, like at risk, where I'm just not sure where I stand. But I guess my concern about the NCEI is it is largely based on CWI. It is a blended index, if you will, 72% CWI and the remainder being cost of living. And I guess where I'm kind of standing on this is, to me, the numbers don't comport with the theory of CWI. And so the theory of CWI is wages will float freely to address, competing jobs, and somewhat factors in cost of living, and somewhat factors in hedonic or exogenous factors, like the attractiveness of living in a particular area. So I think, as I understand it, CWI takes all of those things and says wages will reflect all of those factors pretty quickly, right? It'll adjust pretty quickly. And I guess that sounds good. And I think it's based on kind of the classic economics. Maybe some of us older folks studied, in terms of unemployment's low, wages are going to go up. We'll see wage inflation, but we haven't. We haven't seen wage inflation. We haven't seen wages float or change as dramatically as we did, say, in the 1970s or 80s. So I struggle with the theory of the whole of the construction of this measure, in that I don't see wages adjusting very quickly or at all over the last 10, 20 years based on the factors it presumes will happen. So I just struggle with that CWI index and the NCEI index, again, is 72% CWI. It just, I don't think the theory matches the numbers, if that makes sense. And I'll give you an example. I mean, and I hate to pick it, but I this is what I know. Washoe County has, and Carson City, for that matter, has seen housing prices increase dramatically over the last 6-7 years, but wages don't. Wages haven't. So we have a real problem in terms of attracting labor, because if 40% of your income goes to housing, and your wages haven't grown, but housing's doubled during that time, you just can't make it work. And so to see Washoe County kind of at that lowest number doesn't make sense to me. It has the highest housing costs in the state. And so if wages floated freely to address that, we'd be higher, but we're not. So I have concerns about the index, I guess, is what I'm trying to say.
Any other comments? Yes, Gowdy.
Jason Gowdy for the record. So one point I think that Mr. Johnson made was that the original index only affected one group. And I'm not sure that's completely the full facts, because the Augenblick study had negative amounts included in their original study, to where there were certain groups that were below, and then there was a judgment call to take everybody up to one, which then meant that there was only one. The original assessment did assess all groups. It was just determined that we didn't want to harm, and there was another hold harmless clause essentially evoked that then moved everybody to one. So, that's just one piece of it. The other piece is, I hadn't seen the model itself, but I've got some sense of it. And, I'd want a little bit of time to kind of walk through and understand kind of how it went from the old model, which is the new model, and they're somewhat drastically different results in certain areas. It doesn't make it wrong or right, but I think just some time to actually understand how that worked, because, half the group got to see it and the other half has not yet. And I think that, especially given there's somebody on the group that saw it, this still has a lot of concerns. I still have some, because I haven't even had time to digest it. I think it's an important aspect.
Member Johnson.
Yes, Madam Chair, thank you. Thanks, Jason, appreciate that. And I think the objection that was mentioned about, I agree that it affected all groups. One of the consensuses from the APA was that none of the facts that we have should adversely affect an entity. So that's why one was started, and it would be one and above, which is consistent with the recommendation today. And I think, at least from my perspective, that was not necessarily the issue. The issue was that there was such a narrow focus on the index that it didn't take into consideration other factors of the school district budget, which I think the NCEI does. But here's my issue, that we as our funding and distribution group got to hear the presentation and the information, and I think it's quite a leap of faith for the people who haven't heard that to approve something that they weren't really a part of the discussion. So, Madam Chair, I'm not sure, if I were asked to approve information from the reporting and accountability without really going through that, I do trust the colleagues that are on that, but I would also like to get some more information before saying yes. So it might make sense for them also to hear these presentations or maybe have the approval of these be at a subsequent full commission meeting for your consideration.
I'm actually wondering if we should take a minute to actually see the slide that you were shown with the 3, or do you want us to do that as a separate meeting, items at the separate meeting? There's 2 things I want to consider. We broke into groups because there's a lot of work to do so that we could each see it. But if we keep bringing everything back to redo the entire presentations, then we've sort of lost the impact of the 2 groups. So I want to be mindful that it is good for people to understand what they are about to vote for, but there's also, do we want to replicate all of the conversations that the groups have had? And perhaps there's something in between there. And that's my question. Go, Member Johnson, Member Hobbs.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Sorry, Guy, if I preempted you. Yeah, maybe it makes sense for us to have a brief presentation to kind of encapsulate what we had discussed, so that the members that weren't a part of that might be able to get a better comfort level. Here, we could provide the information that you would reference, because there are some significant pictorial representations for tables that identify what the changes were from a cost of living to a cost of comparable wage index with all employees versus the NCEI.
Okay, Member Hobbs.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I essentially agree with what Paul just said. I think it would be, Amanda's here, and I don't know that you have to go through the entire presentation, particularly the upfront part of it, but she's here, we're here, and it isn't to say that that's going to be enough depth for that to necessarily satisfy everyone today. But I think it would be at least an opportunity to get better acquainted with something that otherwise sounds very mysterious. I would also say, Paul, that, you know, this, of all of the ones that we went over, and in our working group, they were only agendized for a presentation and discussion, no action. So we really didn't have that kind of dialogue about it. I'm not sure that the other ones are quite as difficult as this one is, but I suppose we'll see. And Amanda can go through those as well to the summary pages.
And if Amanda can do that, I'd like to kind of take the stance, if you're all comfortable with this, that if we're going to see the presentation, then we either give them direction on what to bring back next time to make it better, or we come to some sort of decision that it is that we're going to adopt it. Okay. So I don't want to just say, well, gee, I'm just not sure about it. So we either need to see more and more information that's connected to it, or we need to adopt something, I think, is our best course of action. Thanks, Amanda. And hopefully one of those 2 are possible, so we can at least give you direction on what else to take a look at, or that is making us uncomfortable, or that we are able to think forward.
Amanda Brown for the record. I'm going to try to go through this very briefly. I'm going to bounce back to a presentation the working group saw last meeting to give a little context for how we, to Jason's point, moved from the prior study to the current recommendation. So the first thing we started by doing was updating the CWI. As you remember from the prior study, it was fairly old data, so we put it into 2017. We also had heard the feedback that we needed to not limit the number of professions that were included in the CWI's pool, so we expanded it. And then we calculated an adjustment for workers with a BA or higher, workers without a BA, and all workers. So these are the workers with BA or higher is the closest equivalent to what had been in the prior study. So just looking at professional salaries for CWI. So you can see that's kind of the middle column. Then we also had workers with less than a BA and all workers. Based on feedback that we were hearing, the recommendation was to not just look at BA positions, because their experience in districts was that they were competing against all industries, and that a teacher could go get a job in a profession that might not require a BA. So we decided to look at the all workers figure for CWI. And then we looked at a couple different alternatives, including a cost of living only that looks at kind of some information out of the Bureau of Economic Analysis for regional price parities. And then we put forward a number of kind of hybrid approaches, which is where the NCEI comes from. And that one is based upon using the all workers CWI for a district for 72% of the total, because that's the proportion of current expenditures statewide that are for salaries and benefits. The other 28%, we used the goods component of the regional price parities. So we were trying to recognize that there was both differences between districts based on the wages they had to pay, but also for the other costs of getting goods into their communities. So we wanted to recognize both factors. So that's the NCI represents. So the table you see in front of you is what the full just a cost of living using all goods and services and components, including housing, that are part of that RPP cost of living. So that's the first column. Then you see the CWI, which is now expanded to all workers, all education levels, so all professions. The NCI then being, again, a portion of the CWI plus just the subcomponent of the goods piece of cost of living, weighted to create an index, which we thought was fairly representative based on the information we had available of the differences in spending from district to district in costs. So that is how it moved from having, the initial move was first updating the data, expanding the professions and expanding education levels. That's why you see the CWI has changed and expanded beyond being positive in one community. We still recommend it, again, only applying it when it's positive and not harmful. So that's why you'll see some communities lumped up to 1. And then the NCI being a recommendation of our best available information that we had, reflective of current district expenditures. And that's how we land on the NCI column, which positively impacts the majority of districts in the state. So that's how we got from place to place. Any questions? Happy to answer.
Questions and or recommendations of potentially something else to consider? Sure. Yeah. Member Gowdy.
Jason Gowdy for the record. I'm trying to figure out the math on this RCA comparison chart.
Mm-hmm.
So 28% related to the cost of living.
Yeah, and that is Amanda Brown, for the record, a great clarification point, because they don't perfectly line up with that. Let me pull up.
Let me just, you can, what you're thinking. Okay, so I'm looking at the fact that Washoe, to Mark's point, is at 1.012, and that they're still at 1 at the end, and then Clark is at 1.037, which is significantly higher than anybody else, yet and they're all at 1, yet it translates to 1.031 and 1.03. That doesn't mathematically in my head make sense.
Amanda Brown, for the record, and it shouldn't. So what you see in that cost of living, if you look at this table, it's a great question, is the cost of living column was based on the all items within this index.
Okay.
This index is based on goods, services, and rent and services other. The portion that we used for that non-wage 28% was from this goods column. So that's why they don't match up that way.
Okay. Goods columns. Good. Just to clarify, sorry, that means that the housing component got excluded, which is why Washoe is not.
Correct. We use the goods to talk about, for the non-wage expenditures, how much the differential might be to get goods into a certain community. And then for the wages, we use the CWI, and housing under the CWI approach is considered a portion of the wage index. So,
okay, I not that I don't side with Mr. Mathers often, but I have to side with him in this piece. When you look at a financial budget and the single largest component of virtually every person in this world's budget is their house, and I can assure you my wage is not tied to my house payment. And as Reno and Washoe have seen recently, Clark County saw for 20 years where our housing prices were really, and then they started exploding, and wages didn't move at all either. Right. So I think that I have a hard time taking that out of consideration, given the significance of a housing cost as a relation to the income of people. Just my thought.
Do I hear maybe a recommendation to APA to take a look at housing or the connection to that? I'm trying to drive this into either a recommendation to direct them or an adoption of an idea. Johnson.
Madam Chair, yeah, I mean, given that information and the concerns that Mark, I think it's a valid consideration. One of the things that you take a look at whenever you're going to look for a job is whether you can afford to move there. So I think it's certainly a component and something that perhaps needs to be an equity adjustment. So, I mean, I would be comfortable giving direction to APA to consider a factor including that. It could be just another column, I would imagine, if we're looking at a hybrid. But if we do that, in order to get enough clarification of them, are we still looking at this 72% and 28%, but having the 28% include housing? Is that what we're talking about? So I'm looking over at Mark to see more to pick your brain on this than anything else.
Yeah, and I don't know if I have the answers to this, but you know, to follow up on Mr. Gowdy's comment, you know, again, if 40, 50% or more of your income goes to housing, can you adjust this index to reflect, you know, that fact and add in a third factor for, you know, 40% of labor gets applied to housing costs or something?
Let me ask Amanda something. So if you have questions for us to clarify what we're asking you to do, please ask them. Right now, I'll go to Member Gowdy.
Jason Gowdy for the record. So this might help me too. When I asked the question, you answered a little bit that the housing was, I think, built into the CWI. Can you explain that? Because maybe that'll help me. How is it built in? Maybe that.
Sure. Amanda Brown for the record. And built in might not be quite the right terminology, but the theory of action behind the comparative wage index is that you can look at salaries in non-teaching industries, professions, and base the adjustment on the differences in cost in those groups from community to community. And in this case, there's about 4 different blocks of Nevada that are captured through this way. And the idea behind it, the theory of action, is that because you've accounted for the wage, that differential accounts for the underlying differences in cost of living and attraction and amenities of those communities. So it's not a piece that I can necessarily pull out or adjust, but the theory is that it's addressed in that way. So at this moment, I don't have any questions about how to do it. It's just more trying to think through, because we need to be pulling out the CWI and building something else. So I'm not 100% sure yet how to go about that.
Member Gowdy.
Okay, thank you. I think that's important. And you know, I go back to just a couple of examples, and I know they're extreme, but the pay differential, you know, when I was working in industry between here and San Francisco was 20%, 25%. Housing differential was 250%. I think there is such a more significant impact on cost of living as it relates to housing than anything else, because it's such a big piece of your budget. And when it fluctuates, it really, you know, we saw it here in the Valley, which was why we went through a recession. It was nothing else other than the fact that there was so much that the pricing of the houses dramatically impacted us. And I think that how much you weigh that is as important as considering it, in my view.
I'm going to do a check. Does this need to be a motion or anything, or just direction to APA to take this back and take another look at it? I'm looking at you, boss.
Deputy Attorney General Greg Ott, if APA feels they have enough feedback right now that they don't need further action, you don't need a formal motion.
Yes.
Yes. Sure, Member Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I should have asked this earlier. How did you come up with the 72%, 28%?
Amanda Brown for the record. We looked at the most recent district expenditure information and based the percentage on percentage of salary, benefits, and operations. So we excluded capital and debt service.
Okay. Do we think we should ask her just to stay for the next topic, or?
Madam Chair, I think it would make sense for Amanda or APA to provide some introductory comments to the next adjustment factor.
Okay. All right, so discussion. So necessarily small school adjustment. That was a tiered one, 25, 50. So Member Johnson, do you want to kind of give an intro while she finds the couple of slides and we'll get some discussion going?
Yes, Madam Chair, thank you. Paul Johnson for the record. So on the necessarily small schools adjustment, I agree with Guy, this is a less complicated issue. But the issues that we had previously is, and in previous presentations, as I mentioned, we had the 50 threshold, and that was kind of it. And if you were 50 or below, you were qualified, and if you were above that, you no longer qualified. And the information that we received in all the testimony and information from our members here is we needed to look something that was maybe a little bit more broader than that, and also something that was Nevada specific. So in APA's attempts to do that, they went through and they surveyed school districts, solicited information, got more information about school district costs, those characteristics of small schools, either geographically isolated or otherwise, and brought back some recommendations that would in fact broaden that and actually tiered those or stratified those in different amounts.
Amanda Brown for the record. So the first thing we shared just was, as we were thinking about this expansion, was the number of impacted schools. And this is something that Paul reviewed earlier. Originally, we were talking about that up to 50 threshold, which had about 46 schools that were impacted. We looked at tiering all the way up to 150 students, which impacts 83 schools. And the other important point here is that it's not just within rural communities. This impacts a large number of districts that have these schools. So what we recommended was doing two changes to our initial adjustment. One, putting in a floor. So anything less than 7 students still had a teacher and an assistant principal. So we put in a floor for those communities that were smaller. And then as enrollment increased, we gradually increased the number of students per teacher, and then essentially ran this into where it connects with a base amount. So it was tiered to where it would hit what a per student cost would be. And a caveat is that generated per student funding is net a given district's base plus size adjustment. So intersect. You can kind of see on this one just how that adjustment plays out. The smaller you are, the more that generates per pupil. And as you get up to over 125, you start intersecting with where the base would be. And this was just to illustrate what that impact might look like. At a certain point, there's no additional cost because you've been intersected with the base. So it depends on what the base amount was. But we thought that tiered approach made sure there was not a dramatic cliff, that if a district or school gained or lost a student, they would lose the funding. And we did have some conversation around how do you identify those schools? Do you look at them every year? Or do certain schools get designated being necessarily small? So the concerns about if their enrollment fluctuates, what that looks like.
Member Gowdy.
Jason Gowdy for the record. Just for the record, we've had to, and I know I've got a couple of rural representatives out here, we've had to deal with this as we started looking at AB 469, which is now NRS 388G. And we have a proportionality rule that we ensure that we proportionally fund the rurals at the same rate they were done in 2017, which makes sense for the bigger schools. We do have some very small schools as small as 17. And my argument there was that if you fund them on a per pupil basis and they lose 2 students, you're taking away 30% of the funding. It's not that much, but it's significant, or vice versa, they get 30% more. It doesn't make sense. So we kind of essentially implemented a necessarily small schools component. We did it at 100 for no better reason than we talked to that group. We kind of internally looked at where does it make sense to kind of draw the line, and we held them essentially flat funded. And so I would be in support of this because I think that the 50 was too low. I think going up to the 150 and kind of the ratable approach seems logical to me. And given our experience in this piece, I think this is probably a really good approach to doing this.
Other discussion items or questions? Carson City, Member Casey, Member Jensen? Member Casey?
Just a quick question, Member Casey, for the record. Was the, is there a differentiation built in between elementary and secondary?
Amanda Brown for the record. At this time, there is not. One of our considerations going forward is as you think about optimal funding, if you start to make those distinctions, we didn't have good information on any other states that were doing that differentiation. We understand that resources may be different, but we needed more information to be able to make that distinction. So I would recommend thinking through that as part of the optimal funding conversation.
Member Johnson?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Paul Johnson for the record. Yeah, and one of the things to deal with Jason's issue is we talked in our working group is the fluctuations of enrollment for those schools that are on the bubble between tier and tier, and that if they are a couple of students that move in for 1 year, that they aren't just toggling money back and forth based on that fluctuation enrollment. So we talked about a smoothing or an averaging of enrollment, or maybe even identifying those students that are geographically isolated as having their own category and they stay in that category in order to avoid some of the issues that Jason was just talking about, where you kind of arbitrarily are taking money from a school district potentially simply because they had an increase of a handful of students.
Member Hobbs?
At the risk of doing something controversial, like to put forward a motion that we consider adopting the recommendation and including the consideration that Mr. Johnson just mentioned with regard to movement between the different categories. I'm not quite sure how to word that part of it, but you're already on the record, so just to get that part of it moving.
Member Mountford, second. Okay, I have a motion. I have a second. Is there any further discussion on this? All righty. All those in favor say aye.
Aye. Aye.
Okay, good. Any nays? And the motion passes. Taking a look at small district equity adjustment. Member Johnson, did you want to
Yes, thank you.
kick that off?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, the next item was the district adjustments. We covered the necessarily small schools, now the district size adjustment. And again, consistent with the process that we've identified, we have identified issues that merit investigation. We've provided that information to our consultants, and they've researched based on the feedback they've received from us and from public information, and went forth to survey stakeholders and solicit information from school districts and those individuals that would help better identify those cost pressures and challenges that are inherent with small school district, the economies of scale, the need for staffing, specialized services that may not be locally available in school districts or within even their centralized location. I think the results, and Amanda will speak to this shortly, is basically it kind of re-emphasize that the information that they had in their original study seemed to still have merit, so their recommendation was to stay with their original recommendations. And with that, I will turn it over to Amanda with your permission.
Amanda Brown for the record. Exactly what Paul said. We believe the adjustment that we put forward in the study is the right one. We, in prior presentations, made a number of comparisons of the adjustment against funding in other states. We looked at it against current expenditures and again as a relative versus a total dollar figure, and as well as against what was in the was it 2015 AIR study? Might be wrong on the year. 2012, thank you, where they had attempted to take the current district groupings that produce the basic support ratios for each district and strip out what they thought was the scale component of it, the size piece of it, because as you may know, the BSR both looks at scale as well as more of a regional cost, so it kind of blends those two things together. So they had what they believed was the current funding related to size. So for our purposes, we've included this here as the best comparison of what does our adjustment look like against the current funding approach. As you can see, they're very similar. Sorry, one more caveat. This is both our district size and the necessarily small schools layered on top of that, because we separated that out while the study did not. And you see they produce very similar adjustments. In a couple places, there are some differences, but it's not clear at this point if those are related to an issue of density or if it's also based on, the BSR is based on actual expenditures, so if it was just a difference of available resources. But we think this adjustment is supported by best practice research, best practice around the state. Seem to do pretty well of representing current differences in funding within districts in Nevada. So we recommend moving forward that. I know we did have a conversation around how do you treat districts that are very large with different attendance areas, and if you want to think about do you treat them differently. But at this point, that would be more of a policy decision for the group than from the district's adjustment piece.
You look like you had a question.
Sorry,
Member
Jason
Gowdy.
Sorry, Jason Gowdy for the record. You know, I think you just mentioned my concern. While we are the 5th largest school district in the nation, I know New York City does not have the same issue we do. I don't think LA Unified does as well, about the fact that we do have a significant number of rurals. 8469 called that out specifically because of the unique characteristics of our district. And without trying to derail moving this, I think that, you know, I want to at a minimum make sure that we're going back to you and kind of getting some thoughts about how that might work, because I don't know how it actually does work, to give kind of a rural consideration factor to us as well. But I think it is worth discussing because of the fact that, as many people have testified, we're I think the 4th largest rural district in the state alone, right? So it's not it's not, and you know, competition, why we're talking about, I think the largest counties by square mile and stuff, you know, Boulder City is the largest city in the state by square miles. So, and I'm from Boulder City, and that's a rural. So anyway, so I just think that there's certainly some consideration there, and you know, I would like to at least put that up for consideration for the group to think about that. And I don't know how much this group has actually put into that consideration of how that might work, because I know that we do have a lot to do, but at a minimum, I want that at least considered so that if it doesn't get buried, and if we move forward with this now, we at least figure out how that can be considered in the future as we adapt this model.
Member Fueling and then Member Johnson.
Thank you, Chair. I am trying to pull up when the study first came out, trying to model what was happening in the study so you kind of grasp what was happening. And I thought there was some kind of interplay between the small school adjustment and the small district adjustment. Like somehow it was adapting so you couldn't kind of double dip on it, or I don't know if that's right, but I remember that, and I can't find it or figure it out, but it just kind of flashed. I don't know if.
I'm Rand Brown for the record. I don't think I have a good slide to put in front of you for that, but very right. When I said earlier that the necessarily small schools is net of a district's base plus size adjustment. So in a district that already receives a higher weight to adjust up their base funding, you wouldn't double dip by adding the necessarily small schools. It was more to ensure in places where the amount that the necessarily small schools is less or is more than what they would have received through size adjustment, then they receive the funding there. So you're right, it's not a double count there. That's why we tend to show, as in that slide, them added together because they are really two pieces of the size puzzle.
Member Johnson?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Paul Johnson for the record. Kind of a question for Jason. So Jason, I understand your question. Is that something that you would like to see done before making a motion on this, or just something that you would like to see developed as we go through this process? Because as we have all talked about, we have the interest of time, and we're all anxious to get a model so then we can blame Jeremy for the results of it. But basically, that was my question.
Before I answer, can I get clarification? I think AJ might have addressed some of it. So you're saying that there's a net between the two, so people don't typically get a rural and a small. They don't add on top of each other. There's some offset there.
Amanda Brown, for the record, yes, it's offset by the amount they would have received from the base and their size adjustment. So, for example, in say a place that doesn't have a size adjustment, you would be getting the necessarily small schools amount that's generated from. So what was the when there was 5 kids, it was 40,000 a kid. So in a place with a size adjustment of 1, you take that 40,000 minus the base of 6,000, and that's the additional amount per kid you would get. In a district that says had a 50% size adjustment on top of it, you would take the 40,000 minus the 8,000, so the size adjusted, and that's the differential that you'd receive through necessarily small schools.
So let me just simply ask that. So if we determine that Clark gets a rural adjustment, we're going to lose the small school or vice versa, right? So we're going to end up in the net same position. The way the model works or is designed, or very close to it.
Then, for the record, say it one more time.
So if perchance we did, let's say we were treated as a rural, so we get a rural adjustment because it's net, that's somehow going to net against what we get in the small school, because we get a small school adjustment of 5 million or so, or whatever it is, right? So even if we go down this path, the way the model works, there's no net differential in funding to Clark.
Amanda Brown, for the record, there would be no net differential for schools less than 150 where it intersects with the base. So theoretically, in your bigger schools, if you're getting the size adjustment, there is a difference.
Sorry to answer Member Johnson's question. I would propose moving forward with this as something that we should consider and go down that path, because I think there is some merit to it, even if it's slightly incremental. I still think it's the right thing to do, but I think that moving forward with the way that it's been established is probably the most prudent thing for the state to ensure that we get this stood up.
Okay, let's go with Member Matter, and then I'm going to come back and check. That might have been a motion, but I couldn't tell.
So I'm just going to confirm, if that's a motion, Jason, then I'd like to second that motion.
Jason, was that a motion?
Yes, it was.
Great. I will second that motion.
All right, we're on a roll. Okay, in that case, is there any discussion on this motion? We might have to have you restate it, though. So I think I'll restate. I think restating what I think I heard is the motion is to adopt the small district equity adjustment with exploration around the idea of rurals existing in Clark. Is that what the motion
and providing some additional factor at some point, yes.
Okay.
And then for the record, my understanding is to look at attendance centers, so not specific just to Clark, but other communities that could be.
Yes. Just yes. Anybody. Okay. And that motion is second already. No discussion on the motion. In that case, all of those, and just checking, Carson, I didn't see anybody with a question. Discussion on the motion. In that case, all of those in favor, say aye.
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 Okay. I think that was an aye for Dave. Okay, and any opposed? Hearing none, the motion passes. Yes, you may.
Member Beth, I just want to indulge with a comment. Someone, I've forgotten who it was, someone observed the importance of having the public participate. The series of comments that we heard from people that drove very far to be here, I just want to say thank you. And you've done it now twice in a row. So that's how it's supposed to work. And so it has altered my thinking and made me far more aware of an issue. But for you, I wouldn't have been as aware. And we've got a clock that's ticking. And so I hope that you appreciate that it matters. Keep coming. I want to keep moving because at the end of the day, we just all want to get it done.
Thank you for the comment. And for those of us who actually lived in Sandy Valley for 10 years, I know what the drive's like. Okay. Alrighty, then. Alrighty, not much from you, right? Not much of a sympathy vote there. Okay, weights for categories of pupils. Member Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Paul Johnson for the record. I guess the short version is have some work to do on the weights for categories of pupils. We're not at a point where we can make any recommendations. Matter of fact, I think we should have a full commission presentation at some point about the interplay between the two, because I think it affects both working groups, the reporting and accountability and consistency in the way that school districts have to measure and report stuff. And also, we're not quite certain when we talk about the waterfall and moving forward, how that water really falls. Because we have to also keep in mind that the base is a weight. It's a weight of one, but it's perhaps the most important weight out of all of them. So we don't know when we get additional money whether or not it's going to go to which weight or how much it's going to go to weight, whether it's going to proportionally go to one weight and a different one. So I think we need to take a look at that. And probably the most important one of all, because there's federal mandated reporting and minimum spending thresholds in special education, how that's reported and accounted for to make sure that if we do go to a tiered approach, we understand that there is a consistent means among all school districts to categorize those students in their different levels of need and cost. And also to find out, what we found out today is that there is a statistical anomaly with the largest school district that actually has a tendency to skew the weight higher than every other school district, I think, almost other school districts. So when Eureka County School District is an outlier, it doesn't really influence the rest of the state. But in this instance, for example, their weight, I think it was 1.7 or something like that for special education, and others are below that and far below that. So if we have a weight, for example, of 1.7 that we implement in this model, and you're currently funding at a 1.0, where's that money going to come from to fill in that 0.7 that you're now supposed to have to weight? If you're not getting that through the model, if you're held harmless at your $20, but your weight increases, do you now have to transfer more money from your base because you have to meet the maintenance of debit requirements, which are federally mandated? So it's a long story for us saying that we still have some work to do, and that should probably be something that is kind of a combined group meeting or future agenda item. And I'll leave that to the other members of my group if they would like to comment on that.
Member McIntosh.
Thank you, Jim McIntosh, for the record. First, I'd like to say thank you to Member Johnson. I absolutely agree. I think our committee I think it makes sense for the full commission members to hear this. We've had some discussion regarding this in our group, and I think your point is well taken regarding the base being a weight itself and being a weight of one. It's our understanding in Senate Bill 543, and I'm just putting this something further if we could have discussion on Senate Bill 543 is very prescriptive about how, in my opinion, how the waterfall works. Particularly in terms of the base, but there are a lot of questions in our group. How do you augment the base? If the base is inadequate and additional dollars are available from the legislature, what does it take to augment the base as opposed to the base just growing by inflation and caseload and that money flowing then instead to the weights? So that's one of the questions we'd like some clarity on as well.
Other comments, questions? Member Casey, Member Jensen. I just have one. So Ms. Hartz, I'm just going to double check with you. And you can double check with anybody you'd like to. How does this set us up for what we're attempting to do in terms of timeline and all of those kinds of things? You've gotten some direction that says use this definition for at risk as you're looking for other things. You've gotten some clarity around use this weight so we can at least stand it up. So are we on still a good trajectory, or what's this do to life?
Heidi Hartz, for the record, I testified before LCE yesterday that you were all on track. So we're still officially on track. I think that there's a lot of value to the conversations that you're having, and I appreciate that you're pushing ahead in places that you feel comfortable and asking for more information in places that you feel less comfortable or confident. From my perspective, I think you have several options. I think if you reach a point, for example, at the March meeting, that you feel that you can set the weights and move forward, we can make those changes to the blueprint and then ask the school districts to do the comparative analysis. If you don't feel comfortable, we can use the weights as they exist today and ask for the comparative analysis, because it's the information from the school districts about their questions, their concerns, their observations that I believe will drive your recommendations to the governor and the legislature as we move towards July. From a Department of Education budget building perspective, we need to have something in place for the model, probably no later than May, June, because we have to have our budgets completely built by the end of August. And I would offer that even though we have to build the people-centered funding plan as it is currently outlined in statute, you do have that opportunity to make recommendations. So there are opportunities for the governor as well as the legislature to incorporate your recommendations into their planning processes as we move into the next legislative session. So yes, we are currently on track. I think having further conversations doesn't set us behind schedule. And I think there are still opportunities to move forward while you are still making decisions that you feel comfortable and confident about.
Good. I will repeat that wherever I go. We are on track. Member Johnson.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. Paul Johnson, for the record. Just a thought as we were talking about that and talking about the play between the weights before we get to adequacy. And we know that we're going to have school districts when this formula goes into place, where they're going to be held at the 2020 amounts. They're not going to get any additional money. I'm wondering if at some point in the future we might have some sort of discussion, or just one way around that would be as I'm thinking about reporting and accountability, because in theory the money's going to follow the student, but in some instances if you don't have that money, you're going to be reporting less than what the formula really is wanting to push out of there. And maybe until your funding until the formula catches up with your funding, maybe you get a buy on those requirements or something like that, or there's a little bit of flexibility that you have so that your compliance on reporting is a little bit different, because administratively, from a budget perspective, as Jason and I were talking about, the math is pretty easy in the formula. The administration of the human resources and funding that you have to move the chess pieces around is going to be different. And I don't know that if you're having to move that money around to subsidize programs that aren't fully funded, how you can be held to the weighted funding that you're going to get for that program. I don't know if that made any sense. I'm looking over some of my colleagues and they look confused, so it may not have made sense.
Any questions? For Member Johnson? No? Okay. Oh, Member Gowdy.
Not necessarily for Member Johnson, but I think one piece that Member Fueling brought up that I think is very important, I've talked about the base and the importance, because that's going to drive the weights. But as I was talking, and I think that to Member Mathers, is that the way that it's set up, that if they're funded at the 1.7 that the Clark has experienced in special education, they're going to have more money in special education than they currently spend. They're not going to get any more money overall, so that means they're short somewhere else. And so I think one key concept that I would like to get clarity on is the amount of discretions that the school districts will have within this model in order to protect those that are getting the hold harmless, so that, that what flexibility will they have to stay at those levels and be in compliance with the law, as well as meet the weights and everything else, because I think that's an important concept, and that'll help. I think probably alleviate some stress from some of the districts that might be losing if they know that they're going to get some flexibility. And I think we need clarity on that, because I think that'll drive the discussion around the weights.
That's kind of the same thing. Member Mathers?
So thank you, Mr. Gowdy. Mark Mathers. I guess as I was thinking about it over lunch, I think part of I'm going to ask in future items to talk about the model a little bit more. I think part of our challenge is we are mixing sources and uses. That we are taking what local districts spend on special ed and counting it as a source, and it is not. Those are general fund monies, so they are base dollars. Now we may have to spend it on special ed, and that's right. We understand that, but I think that's the problem right now that we have. We're mixing sources and uses, and so if we can clarify that next meeting, I think maybe we can resolve this.
Any other comments? I just have I want to kind of go back to the original discussion around transparency though. So as we move through this and start to think about flexibility, we don't want to lose the concept of transparency. I want to go back to what Member Mather said earlier today. This is the first time you've been able to look at a document and be able to actually say, this is how much was spent on, which is expenditures, not sources. But we don't want to lose that ability either. So it's that nexus between how much flexibility and discretion versus the transparency of where the dollars are going. And where do we find the potentially sweet spot? We hope it exists. Right? Okay, good. So we have at least two and we are on track. So moving on to number 8, and that is discussion and possible recommendations. And that is about regarding a format for budget projections. Do we have, Member McIntosh, do we have any kind of discussion moving toward a recommendation, or is that something you'd like to?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I thought we discussed this last time, and so we as a commission take a look at the 2 forms that were directly out of the state forms provided by the Department of Taxation. Had agreed that that the Department of Education would come back and modify those forms. That's what they did today in our work group meeting. The work group agreed with what Mr. Kirkpatrick had done. He was also planning on reaching out to school districts. My understanding was the first week of March, just in case, send those sheets out, and in case there were some unique, like I said previously, unique items that some school districts needed added or had questions on, they could begin the process again, filling in the information for those budget projections. And so unless there were some questions here, I don't see Mr. Kirkpatrick here to present the final document, but I believe we had agreed on those documents. And this is strictly for this comparison purposes and the way they would be filled out at a very high level.
So was that a motion that was made? Or do we need to make a motion for NDE to move forward with that? Or are you moving forward?
I'll make another motion if you'd like. And so
no, if we've done this, we don't need to revisit. It's on the agenda, so I want to make sure that we've done our due diligence in moving them forward. So
I guess my question would be to the commission: was this not the same agenda item that we agreed to last time? Okay.
I think we're good. I just wanted to make sure that yes, Member Mathers.
So, Mark Mathers, I'd like to make one clarification. I think I agree that I think we approved this last meeting. That looked good, but I wanted to make one clarification that when districts have to report on the budget breakdown under the new model, that would be based on the hold harmless being in effect. In other words, what we saw today from Mr. Aguero did not have the hold harmless effect on, the whatever, button on or whatever. So what the numbers we saw were based on a non-hold harmless kind of scenario. But
we know the law says they're supposed to be held harmless. So I just wanted to clarify ultimately what districts will have to break out under the new model will be, again, with hold harmless in effect. Just want to clarify with NDE, I guess, that would be the case.
Heidi Hartz for the record. I would recommend that we have all school districts prepare the budget for the comparative analysis based on the distribution of funds for the pupil-centered funding plan using fiscal year 20 information. I think there's value in letting every school district go through that process and to raise questions. Again, recognizing that using 20 data isn't really sharing with us who's going to be in hold harmless and who isn't, because the hold harmless provision is for fiscal years 22 and 23. I think if we were to have school districts, if we run the model and say school district A is going to get less money under the pupil-centered funding plan, therefore they'd be hold harmless, and now they don't need to do the comparative analysis, they miss out on the opportunity to contribute to the process and provide all of you with information that may drive your recommendations moving forward.
As a follow-up though, okay. I'm not saying we wouldn't have a comparative analysis, but if say 12 out of 17 districts get less money under the no hold harmless scenario, which wouldn't happen, right? I mean, I don't know what value there is. Say Washoe County gets 50 million less. Instead of having a budget of 488 million, we have 438 million. I guess I don't see any value to us simulating what that would look like when in fact that wouldn't happen under SB 543, right? So I mean, what I'm saying is fiscal year 20 should factor in the hold harmless clause. I mean, it's still going to be, I think, meaningful to see the breakout between the weights and base, but I don't want to, right? I mean, I guess I'm trying to figure out the point of modeling something that won't happen.
Member Mather. This is Puna Method, so a totally different perspective on the same issue. I think it's really important that in the spirit of transparency that we show all of the community what could be if we don't address adequacy. Because at the end of the day, every point of pain that we've heard anything about is a function of inadequacy. We've known that for a long time. And for some of us, the theory of action that made sense was first, let's get the formula understandable and reasonable and transparent so that we can then make a case to the public for increased funding. And so if we blunt or bubble wrap the reality, I think we're doing a real disservice, frankly, to the potential for what a realistic conversation about education and its needs in Nevada. Just a different perspective.
Member Gowdy, and then I want to just go back. We've already taken care of this item, so I want to make sure that we move on to the next.
Jason Gowdy for the record. So I think to Member Matter's comment, the budget that you're going to provide to the schools is going to be no bigger. This is not putting it into the model and showing us at full weights and everything else and add $1 billion to the budget. This is still going to be within the same monetary constraints as piece. So there is no view of this is what it could look like. There's no adequacy discussion in this piece. This is purely just to say what happens under the new model versus the old model. And I have to agree with Mr. Mathers again that if you're going to build this model and not have the hold harmless clauses in, you're going to give Park his $50 million. We're going to show $50 million more in expenditures than we're ever going to get under the new model. So I really think this should be based off of, okay, what really would we get, which we would really get the number after hold harmless in this period. I know it's kind of hard because you're holding harmless the same year as actually the base of hold harmless. So I understand the challenge, but I understand the concern. I think the adequacy piece needs to be addressed later and that's separate, but the way that this model is supposed to work is we're supposed to do a comparison of what the funding under the Nevada plan looks like compared to the new plan. The new plan has hold harmless. And I think if we ignore that, the comparison becomes less valid than anything else. So.
I mean, and to follow up, you're going to unnecessarily scare most of the school districts in the state, and you're going to tell Clark County they've got more money than they really do.
Link back to item 8. And so we have a template they are going to use. So are we making, and there has been a motion that was approved in the past to use the recommended template. Are we having a discussion about how to use that or recommendations, or is this something we're going to talk about in the future with the reporting monitoring group? I'm trying to get this into the world of, are you making a motion? Are we making a recommendation? Are we just sharing that we think this is a concern? And monitoring and reporting group, I guess the question is this something you want to take forward in your next meeting so you can talk about it? Move to future agenda items so we can do that.
All right.
Member McIntosh.
Jim McIntosh, for the record. Madam Chair, I really would like to move forward on this item, only because I think the large discussion in our group surrounding these budget projections is the value these budget projections provide, particularly in this current fiscal year. So I'm not talking about the comparisons to distributions that we're going to that school districts receive in the future, but we're talking about a comparison under the old model to this model. And to Mr. Commissioner Mather's point, there is a hold harmless that says he's not going to get any less money than he got this year. So this has kind of been our difficulty in trying to come up with what these budget projections look like. How do we project the model where he doesn't get any less money? We give him the same, then give him his school district will get the same amount of money. So why would he even change the way he budgets if he's already budgeted for that amount of money? Where it might make some difference would be for a school district like Clark that might receive some additional dollars. Our goal was to try to say, here's what the base would look like. Here's what the changes might look like to the state forms. There's some assistance to the Department of Taxation in terms of what the forms may have to change to look like. Here's what the comparisons may be. But I would honestly defer to the Department of Ed because we have been struggling to determine what the value is of this budget comparison in fiscal year 2020. If there's a hold harmless in place, and one, and two, for a school district like Clark that might get additional money, we're talking about the current budget year. This is not real money they got. Why would they go through the exercise of trying to appropriate, where would they appropriate those dollars? So in other words, why would they try to figure out if they received hypothetical $10 million extra, how much work do we want them to do to go figure out how they would appropriate those dollars in fiscal year 2020 that they didn't receive, right? Except for what program or function they would appropriate those dollars under. So in other words, if you've got additional at-risk dollars, you'll appropriate additional at-risk expenditures. I don't need to know that you might buy more supplies or more services, or that's the point I'm trying to make. And that's been the difficulty in saying, what if someone could explain to us if there's some value out of this that we're missing, then I would look to the Department of Ed. But my preference would be move this item forward as simply as possible. So if there's a hold harmless in place, then to me it makes sense to keep the hold harmless in place for Washoe. If I don't know what the point of the exercise is. But
Member Johnson.
Thank you for your patience. Paul Johnson, for the record. I agree with all that. I think really all we really need to know is what's the difference between the two models, the dollar amount, and what impact is that potentially going to have on your school district. I don't think the intention is for a full-blown budget, figure out what it is it's going to be. If I'm going to lose $1 million, I need to make budget decisions moving forward to get my budget to fit within that. That's not something that, if that's a 3 or 5 year plan, that's not something the board's going to be able to tell you in 1 year of transition. It's going to, because all of that is going to depend on local deliberation and school board meetings and parents showing up to the meetings and a lot of that stuff. So I don't see any value in preparing a budget. I really think the intent was really just to find out what the difference is, have the formulas be side by side so that we can see what the difference is. And that difference is going to impact school districts, but I don't think that we really should have our budgets based on 2 scenarios.
Member Maxwell.
So Jim McIntosh for the record. The only value we found in doing it, and I and Paul were talking at a really high level in the two documents we presented last time, has been in where those line items are reported, right? And so no longer will you receive many local revenues like sales tax or property tax. Those will all be state-supported revenues. And then there will be 3 additional line items, right, for the weights that you will receive. And I don't know if that's helpful to see that. In terms of, so people can compare what those revenues would look like on a form at a very high level to compare to what they look like now. The amended final budgets that have been already presented to the Department of Taxation, but that was the only value I think I'm agreeing with you. That's the only value there was during this exercise.
Did you have another question? I'm going to recap what I think I hear and what I think I know. What I think I know is the last time around, we took a look at a high-level budget that would be reported that everybody agreed to and move forward. And that NDE is working to refine that, work with that, and get feedback from the district. So it is at a high level, and that is the report that we will use as the comparative analysis in May or June. Is that what I understand? I love it when I pay attention, but I don't anywhere hear a motion to change anything, move anything. We just now clarified what we're doing and why we're doing it.
Member McIntosh, I'm not proposing a motion to amend anything. And so I would look in March for the NDE to provide the direction to the school districts based off the recommendations we've given them.
Okay, great. To future agenda items. I would like to get some clarity around comments made around weights, base, and maybe having the full commission hear about those, both from the sort of formulaic side, but also how much flexibility and reporting side is. That is, again, if we could talk about that, is that what you're thinking? Recommendations regarding how that would occur or what you would hear about in future meetings? Okay. Member Getty?
Jason Getty for the record. So I think given the number of testimonies yesterday on Zoom and Victory, I think it would be beneficial to have the academic teams come in from Washoe and Clark and then any other district to actually provide the data around the effectiveness of those programs. So I think that would be important for this group to look at. I know we heard a lot of testimony about the effectiveness. I think it would be good to hear from the academics about how those programs are working, because I think that would be beneficial to this group as we look at the weights.
Okay. Anybody else? Member Hobbs?
I'm probably just repeating what Paul already said, but we have the cost adjustment factors rework, right? And the weights to bring back, at least. You already said that, right?
And I'm hearing cost adjustment factors would be for the working group focused on that, but I'm hearing weights would be a discussion for all. Okay. Member Mann.
Mark Mathers for the record. So just again, to kind of repeat an earlier item, I'd like to look back or re-look at the blueprint and talk again about how those weights were built, i.e. using local dollars, and would ask applied analysis to consider my point that we were mixing sources and uses, and right, so that what I'm asking is to reconsider whether or not really we should include local dollars that go towards the weights in that model or not.
Okay. Other comments, suggestions for future? Ooh. I believe we are on item number 10. Public comment. Any public comment in the South? Steve Oxford.
Chair McCormick Lee, members of the commission, my name is Stephen Augsburger. I represent the Clark County Association of School Administrators and Professional Technical Employees. I apologize for my comments late in the day. I know we're all ready to go home. And I want to say I appreciate very much the time that you're devoting, the discussion that's occurring to this important topic. One of the things that I want to put on your radar for future consideration is this. I think we can all agree that across the state of Nevada, the biggest single expense for every school district is salary and benefits. We heard Amanda Brown say earlier, 72% average statewide. I know in Clark it is around 88%. And when we think of that in the context of differences between the Nevada plan and the new funding formula that's being developed, under the Nevada plan, those of you who work for school districts know annually there is a 2% roll-up that's approved by the legislature. That roll-up is designated specifically for lateral movement across the salary schedule. In the legislative appropriations report, it defines the purpose of that as an incentive for employees to continue with professional growth, and those steps then would be approved. The second piece of that roll-up is health benefit money that's approved by or recommended by the governor, approved by the legislature. During this last legislative session, the 2% roll-up for salary growth, it's not COLA, it's growth on the salary schedule, was approximately $160 million. The health benefit money was around $30 million. Under the new plan, under the old plan, that money was included in the DSA. School districts then use that money to move people along the salary schedule. Typically, it wasn't negotiated. My concern is, as we move to the new funding formula, that this process thus far does not address the biggest single expense that every school district has. I know that there is a desire to have greater discretion and greater flexibility to spend dollars, but I do believe we would do a disservice to 50,000 employees in the state of Nevada not to address specifically how that piece is going to work. It's not about collective bargaining. It's about money that's designated by the legislature going into the DSA, and then for what purpose is it used in school districts? Is it going to be used for the purpose the legislature approved it, or does it get dispersed to other things? So I would just hope as we move forward that we give significant consideration to how do we keep employees working? How do we keep them producing? Because it will do no good to have a great funding formula for kids if we have a dissatisfied workforce. And that's what will happen if we don't address this. Thank you.
Thank you. And Martha, did you get a card from Mr. Oxberger? Can you make sure we do that? Thank you. I'm going to keep track of everybody. Okay, any other public comment from Las Vegas? Any public comment from Carson?
There is none.
Hearing none, then let's adjourn the meeting. Have a great weekend.
to edit it.